Hey, so right now I'm tied up trying to learn Axis Empires, and I've run out of things that I'm uploading. And I've done this a couple of other times with other games. In this case, I'm going to do a quick hit on Once Upon a Time. This is Atlas Games. It's the only game I have by them. I have two copies of this. I have the original and then the second edition. The original was very, very cool, and I fell in love with it. And then I liked the better components quality on the second edition well enough that when I saw it, I picked it up. Mixed on feelings on the actual component here. So the colors, the symbols, etc. The original, I think, was kind of in a monochrome type hand drawing. It was very easy to assess what you had in your hand and figure out. And I find this version a little harder, but I ended up giving the original to my brother, and so this is what I'm stuck with. The cards are sturdier. It's definitely higher quality in terms of cost, but I find playability-wise, it's a little more difficult to deal with this. Let me explain what the game's about. So, it's kind of an interesting game, and I'm not going to, like I said, it's going to be a quick hit. I'm not going to do it the way I would do a normal game. But what you have is each player gets a handful of these story elements cards. And there's a number of different types. They have a picture on them to help evoke an idea of what is going on. And then a term, or whatever you want to call it. In this case, it's an event. There's different kinds of cards for events, places, people, attributes, all kinds of stuff that you might want to fit into how you're telling your story. But in this case, it says people meet. So if you were telling a story and you expressed that people meet, this would be the card that you would use for that. So what you have is a handful of cards. Now, the victory conditions for the game involve getting rid of your handful of cards and then playing what's called your goal card at the end, which has to be played at a time when you tie the whole story together. And in this, for example, this one says, "You have freed me from my enchantment, and tomorrow we will be married." And you have to basically come to an ending that says that, and then finish it off by playing that card, after having gotten rid of your entire hand. Now, what happens is one player is selected, and in the original game it was the person with the longest beard, which was kind of cool, except I had a buddy who actually usually had a longer one than I did. But anyway, then you rotate in general. You want to give each person a chance to be able to start the story, because there's a real power to controlling what the story's main starting characters are going to be, etc. It can flow away from that. And then you start to speak your story, and I'm going to tell this not so much according to the rules, but according to how I like to play the game, which is, although the rules kind of hint towards some of this, you take a few minutes to decide what you're going to start with your story, looking at your final card, looking at your hand. Let me grab 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's grab 5 cards and an end card. So let's say I have, oh, this is the one I just did. I played this with my wife. It's not a great game in 2 players. Generally, I like it better in 3 or 4. Much more than that, and it starts getting a little too chaotic. But in 2 players, there's just not quite enough different inputs into the story. And it's also very easy for someone to get kind of left out of the story. And that's more annoying to me in a small number of players. I've got kind of a powerful personality, and you know, no matter how many players there are, I'm going to try to direct the story in the direction I want. But for some people, just sitting back and kind of watching the whole thing is better. And if you're in that position in a very small number of players, that doesn't work terribly well. Anyway, so this is where I'd be heading. Let's say I have these: crown, mountain, tower, time passes, and bird. So, you know, I could look at these and kind of come up with an idea of a story. Once upon a time, and I'm thinking, okay, who are the evildoers going to be, and what do they have done? And I think they're going to want to steal the crown. Okay, and I would start with Once Upon a Time. There was a group of gypsies who went from town to town. This is actually the story I took before as part of, you know, they'd go from each town and entertain the villagers there. Now, at any time in this, if somebody had a card that fit this nicely, in this case, say, I don't have one just sitting out here nicely, but let's say they had a village card. Because I said that word, they can play that card and say, okay, I'm taking over. They've interrupted me. Now, my penalty for that is I draw another card. And my turn ends, and the new person who interrupted gets to take over the story. That's the base means of interrupting. Let me go into the other. One of the other restrictions that I like to play with, generally it's no more than one card per sentence. Sentence is kind of not terribly well defined in the rules. So there's kind of this, you should not be playing card after card after card. You should be building the story more and adding the cards as they fit, but not really worrying too heavily about the victory conditions per se. You're aiming for them, there's no question there. But the story is more important than winning the game. I've seen people play, oh, and there was a bird, and some time passed, and they're just going through their cards and trying to say everything in them rather than build the story around them. It's more important, I think, to have a good time building the story than trying to aim to win. So, with my example, okay, and they went from village to village, and then they heard rumors of a hidden crown that had been lost, of the old kings, of the ancient kingdom. And they decided that if they could find this, they would be quite wealthy. And see, I'm trying to aim for getting them in some kind of situation where they will be recognized as the evildoers, and I know I'm not linking it well, my cards didn't work well, this one was already in my head, so I'm going to have them do bad things to build towards this, but I also have to work with the cards in my hand. Now there's one other kind of card here that I haven't explained much, which is a pure interrupt. An interrupt is played in two ways. One, it can be played like a card. For example, this one says maybe played as blind, the attribute blind. And what that would mean, or aspect blind, sorry. What that would mean is if I wanted to say, and unfortunately one of the gypsies was blind, I could play it like that as part of my sentence. But alternatively, and this is where these are really powerful, if I want to take control of the story, normally the only way I can do it is wait for someone to say the word I have in my card. Now, there's another thing I like to do, and this is clearly against trying to win the game, but I like to work as many words into my story that I don't necessarily have cards for. So, I'm mentioning, an ancient kingdom, there's a kingdom card in here. I'm mentioning, what else? The gypsies, there isn't a gypsy card in here, but a village, there were villages in here, and things like that, in the hopes of giving someone an opportunity to step in and change the story. You don't want to totally control the story for maximum enjoyment of this. And that's what a game like this is really about. It's not a competitive game at all, even if you are kind of trying to win. You also shouldn't be focused primarily on trying to win, is what I'm saying. And that could be really disappointing to some people. So, if someone had played... Let's find... There aren't a lot of these interrupts, but I'm looking in particular. Okay, let's look at this one. Here's an interrupt for character. And if I went with... and as the gypsies were traveling, they heard a strange song, and they wandered deeper into the woods. And all of this is dangerous, because somebody might play forest instead of woods, and kind of say, well, it's not exactly the same word, but it means the same. And that's always up to interpretation for this. And they investigated to hear where the song was coming from, and they saw a beautiful bird. And I'm ready to keep going. But someone else has this card. And the bird is a character card, so they can trump in with this. And just as though they had played the bird card instead during my story, they take control of the story. I have to draw a card as a penalty. And they can now take the story away according to what their hand and their final victory condition, which might be completely different. And to this day, no one knows where she ran to. What? That has nothing to do with the story I was building, but that's part of the excitement of the game, with each player kind of working towards one another to get their own variant of the story. A couple other bookkeeping things in here about the game. Instead of, at times, even I, but many players will find that it's hard to keep going with your story, that you're kind of stumbling around. And as a group, you can basically say, look, get on track or whatever. And the person has to kind of either clean up their act and get the story moving along, or they have to pass. And they can do this on their own as well with, I just don't know where I'm going. In case of a pass, and I just found this I think changed in the second edition. In the first edition, you just took another card and bang, you're back in there. In the second edition, you take a card and you can discard a card. And there's also an optional rule that allows you to discard your ending and draw a new ending. And in that case, you'd still take a card. The penalty of taking a card isn't necessarily that bad, because when you're down low in cards, you're at a point where, especially if you don't have an interrupt in hand, unless bird or crown it comes into the story, I'm not going to be able to trump in with these. Now, if I hold an interrupt, and you should always hold your interrupts probably as long as you possibly can, unless you really need to get control of the story. Unless I have an interrupt towards the end of my hand, I'm going to have a hard time getting back into the story. I just don't have the hand of cards to jump in and take control. So there's kind of this balance between I want to get rid of my cards and I also want to be able to control the story, because I can't win unless I'm the storyteller. I'm the only person who can end the story on my card. So that's one of the difficulties with it. Another one is that if you don't have a lot of cards, you don't have a great idea how to get your story from point A to point B. So once you get down to this alone, you might have a lot of story to tell to get to so the evildoers were thrown down a well. And at that point, without the cards to help guide me, sometimes the story becomes a little rushed because I'm trying to get it to that end. And that's something to try to avoid. But on the other hand, it's almost natural. I don't have any more story elements to play, so I'm going to direct it as plausibly as possible. And here's the danger is, well, you've got to start, you've got to try to tie loose ends together and everything. Speaking of tying loose ends together, a nice strategy that I've found in the game is to bring something into the story, like, say, a character like an evil witch. Make them key to the story and not play the card. Hold it in your hand, because that key element of the story is likely, if players are going to be kind of good and fair to the story, to come back into play. Is that kind of gamey? That may be, but I think it's a better form of gamey than just killing off the main character to avoid a situation like that. Anyway, this is one of the few games that I've ranked a 10. I'm not going to really play it in front of you. That doesn't make a lot of sense because I'd be running back and forth between characters. It's a very interactive game. You're sitting at the table. Everybody's concentrating, focused in on the story, looking for the card in their hand. The more players you have, here's another bonus, the less cards you have in your hand. So a good string will get you out of the story quickly. As well, you don't have to focus on as many cards. So in the 2-player game, I'm going to have a hand of, say, 10 cards. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's really tough to sort these cards, and I generally sort them by type, in such a way that I can see all the important words that I need to be able to interrupt effectively into the hand. So there's kind of a perfect size hand. I like to get rid of a few cards and a small number of players very quickly. I like to get my hand down to 5 or 6 cards where I can pay attention to those key things, have a couple of interrupts in my hand if possible, and then take control when I can and try to make my run for the victory. Anyway, like I said, this is one of the few games that I've rated a 10. I think it's damn near perfect for what it tries to do. You've got to be with the right group of people, though. If you're with someone who wants to just play every card, and there was a mountain, and on top of the mountain there was a tower, and some time passed and the tower fell down, and a bird sang about that. Yeah, that's not going to be any fun at all. And so many times I've seen someone like that in a game that's really bad at, say, 3 players. Once you get to 5 players, someone who's doing that, they're going to get interrupted on, and most of the players are going to kind of agree to foil their attempts at telling the story and allow the people who seem to be making the best effort at telling a story to keep going more, even if they can interrupt in. Like, I will definitely interrupt in on somebody who's not promoting the story well and not making a good story, using up a valuable interrupt card just to prevent the story from getting bland and uninteresting. But if you're only playing with 3 players, say, that's going to be really tough to have that kind of I don't know, peer pressure to do better each time. And sometimes you'll see people start out very poorly with the game. They don't have a good feel for it. But as they see other people playing and see how much fun there is to be had in that direction, they can play it very well. If you had a group of people who all were just trying to win the game, and that's their only solid aspect to it, they probably aren't going to enjoy this much at all. It's got to be more of a social shared cooperative storytelling than it does an attempt to win the game. Winning the game's great and all, but in the end, it is the story that matters most. And that's what I think you want to aim for, to have the most fun. I may be wrong. There may be groups who really want to play it very competitively and can have an enjoyable time with it. But what I've noticed for the most part is the people who do play it too competitively are less they take the game as less enjoyable than someone who is taking it as a non-competitive exercise and more just enjoying the funny story that comes out and the silly situations and the really awful things you can do to one another and to one another's story is more, and to the characters within the story. And you can get really silly in it. There's some expansions to it. I saw one for dark stories. I don't feel like that's necessary. I feel like I can make stories in this pretty damn dark without much help. But I could see where additional characters that aren't in this normally would be kind of helpful. And that may be the big advantage, is adding a few more cards, a few more types of things. Because it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover different kinds of monsters and stuff like that. And anyway, definitely something that if you want a kind of lighthearted, enjoyable thing, not necessarily an end-of-the-night filler type thing, although if you're kind of buzzed, it's a lot of fun in that circumstance too. I would definitely suggest picking this sucker up. On the other hand, if you don't think that you'd be into something that's not really a competitive game, stay away from this. I doubt that you'll enjoy it much. Alright, that's it.